On va y arriver. Voilà. I think we are going to start. Everything is ready now. Okay. Welcome here to the Press Club in Geneva, ladies and gentlemen. We have the pleasure to have today with us different representatives of the Tibetan community in Geneva. Welcome to you. Welcome also to all of those who follow us on YouTube or on our website, www.pressclub.ch. It's a pleasure to have you here for this session, for this press conference, and you are going to talk about an old fact, but still that happened a long time ago, some 28 years ago, but that is still pending, and it's about the disappearance of the 11th Panchen Lama. In this case, is still unresolved, and you are going to tell us more about it today. So, without going any further about the context of the conference, I would like to give the floor to Yongga. Yongga is the head of the Tibetan community in Geneva. So welcome to you, and I let you present your speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The Tibetan Community of Geneva is very happy to organize this press conference today to call upon China to release one of the longest enforced disappeared Tibetan religious figures, Panchen Gedhun Choekyi Nyima. For 28 years now, the well-being and whereabouts of 11th Panchen Lama of Tibet continues to remain unknown. The 11th Panchen Lama of Tibet, Gedhun Choekyi Nyima, was recognized by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1995, and within 3 days of his recognition, he and his entire family was abducted by the Chinese government on 17th May 1995. Since then, there has been no reliable information on his or his family's well-being and whereabouts. The enforced disappeared case of the 11th Panchen Lama of Tibet is declared one of the unresolved cases by the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearance. Despite repeated international outcries, China continues to turn deaf ears. In view of ever-growing China's aggressive control over Tibetan Buddhist religious tradition and suppression of fundamental rights in Tibet and regions under its control, the global calls to bring China accountable for its crime is more crucial than ever. Allow me to read the same information in French. La communauté tibétaine de Genève organise une conférence de presse aujourd'hui pour demander à la Chine de libérer l'une des personnalités religieuses tibétaines disparues depuis plus longtemps, le Panchen Lama. Depuis 28 ans maintenant, le bien-être et l'endroit où se trouve le 11e Panchen Lama du Tibet continuent de rester inconnus. Le 11e Panchen Lama du Tibet a été reconnu par sa sainteté, le Dalai Lama, en 1995, et dans les 3 jours suivant sa reconnaissance, lui et toute sa famille ont été enlevés par le gouvernement chinois le 17 mai 1995. Depuis lors, il n'y a eu aucune information fiable sur son bien-être ou celui de sa famille et sur l'endroit où il se trouve. Le cas de la disparition forcée du 11e Dalai Lama du Tibet est déclaré l'un des cas non résolus par le groupe de travail des Nations Unies sur les disparitions forcées. Malgré les cris internationaux répétés, la Chine continue de faire la sourde oreille. Compte tenu du contrôle agressif toujours croissant de la Chine sur la tradition religieuse bouddhiste tibétaine et de la suppression des droits fondamentaux au Tibet et dans les régions sous son contrôle, les appels mondiaux pour amener la Chine à rendre compte sur ces crimes sont plus cruciaux que jamais. Merci. Donc, nous avons ici au podium le vénérable Dzikab Rinpoche, l'abbé du monastère du Tashi Lumbo en exil, qui est accompagné de son assistante à Vénérable Toblak. Ils sont ici pour diriger la tournée de plaidoyer pour le 11e Panchen Lama. Venerable Zikab Rinpoche, abbot of the Tashilumpo Monastery in exile, accompanied by his assistant, Venerable Toblak, are here to lead the advocacy tour for the 11th Panchen Lama. Donc, il va prendre la parole et puis ensuite, j'ai Madame Tile Choekyi qui a officiellement pris ses fonctions de représentante de sa sainteté le Dalai Lama et de l'administration centrale tibétaine pour l'Europe centrale et orientale le 30 juin 2022. Auparavant, elle était nommée spécialement pour les droits de l'homme au même bureau de septembre 2019, août à 2021. Elle a également travaillé comme chercheuse au bureau des Nations Unies de l'European Union et des droits de l'homme du Central Tibetan Administration à Dharamsala en Inde. Ms. Tile Choekyi formally took charge as the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration for Central and Eastern Europe on 30 June 2022. Prior to this, she was the special appointee for human rights at the same office from September 2019 to August 2021. She also worked as a researcher at the UN, EU and Human Rights Desk of the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala, India. And then we have Mr. Adrien Claude Zoller, who has devoted a good part of his life to the defense of human rights. He has traveled the world to fight injustice in its all forms. Adrien Claude Zoller notably created the NGO Geneva for Human Rights, of which he is president. Monsieur Adrien Claude Zoller a consacré une bonne partie de sa vie à la défense des droits de l'homme. Il a voyagé dans le monde entier pour combattre l'injustice sous toutes ses formes. Adrien Claude Zoller a notamment créé l'ONG Genève pour les droits de l'homme, dont il est président. Donc, pour commencer, je vais demander à Madame Marguerite Canta, membre de la Société d'amitié suisse-tibétaine, qui va lire la communiqué de presse du groupe parlementaire pour le Tibet. Pardon, excusez-moi.
Donc c'est au nom du groupe parlementaire pour le Tibet, groupe qui est basé donc à Berne, ce sont des parlementaires suisses, que je vais lire cet appel adressé aux Nations Unies. Et cet appel est adressé aux Nations Unies plus précisément à l'intention du haut-commissaire pour les droits de l'homme, M. Volker Türk. Appeal to the UN. Urge the People's Republic of China to stop the destruction of Tibetan culture. Honorable Mr. High Commissioner Türk, on the occasion of the visit of Venerable Zikab Rinpoche, abbot of Tashilumpo Monastery, to Geneva, the parliamentary group, Tibet, calls on the United Nations to put pressure on the authorities of the People's Republic of China to end their systematic and extensive policy of destroying Tibetan culture and to allow freedom of religion, language, education and expression in the People's Republic of China. In particular, the Tibet group draws attention to the disappeared Panchen Lama, the re-education programs for Tibetans, and the forced boarding schools for Tibetan school children. Remembrance of the disappeared 11th Panchen Lama. Tashilumpo Monastery is the headquarters of the Panchen Lamas. In Tibetan religious tradition, the Panchen Lama plays a crucial role in recognizing the incarnation of the next Dalai Lama and is his spiritual teacher and tutor. The 11th incarnation of the Panchen Lama, identified by the 14th Dalai Lama, the 6-year-old Gedhun Choekyi Nyima, disappeared without trace in Tibet in May 1995, 3 days after his official recognition along with his family. To this day, the PRC government refuses to provide any information about the whereabouts and well-being of him and his relatives. Instead, a boy compliant with the government was installed as Panchen Lama without any legitimacy. The PRC's calculation is clear. This is to one day recognize the incarnation of a Dalai Lama controlled by the PRC authorities. Forced retraining and resettlement of Tibetans, a government program that has been in operation since 2015, pursues the mass transfer of agricultural workers into quote-unquote, re-education programs with subsequent resettlement to other regions of the PRC. The program involves large-scale, systematically and centrally supervised training of redundant agricultural workers with subsequent transfer to other regions of Tibet or Chinese provinces in low-skilled occupational sectors. In militarily organized camps, those affected are also subjected to political and cultural indoctrination. So far, about 600,000 Tibetans, more than 15% of the population of the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, have been affected. According to official statements, the aim of these trainings is to strengthen the low work ethic, to prevent backward thinking, and to weaken the negative influence of religion in order to eliminate lazy people. UN human rights experts had recently expressed concern that this program was deliberately uprooting and alienating traditional Tibetans. Forced boarding schools with Chinese education for Tibetan school children. Since 2021, Tibetan children of kindergarten age and above have been forced into a boarding school system where they have taught exclusively in Chinese language and culture werden. Nearly 1 million children, or almost 80% of Tibetan school children, aged 4 years and older, are forced to live in these boarding schools. The education and life away from their homes radically alienate the children from their family, tradition, and religion. This practice, too, was recently criticized by UN special rapporteurs as a policy of assimilation by the Chinese government that violates human rights. Not individual cases, but systematically planned destruction of Tibetan culture. It is becoming clear that the abduction of the recognized Panchen Lama and the installation of a candidate who is compliant with the government, as well as the system of re-education programs, our forced boarding school are not arbitrary individual cases, but systematically planned steps towards the destruction of Tibetan culture and identity, says National Councillor Nicolas Valder, co-president of the Parliamentary Group Tibet. The Parliamentary Group for Tibet appeals to the UN to urge the People's Republic of China to immediately stop the destruction of Tibetan culture. On behalf of the Parliamentary Group for Tibet, with the utmost respect, MP, so the National Parliament, Nick Guger, co-president, Fabien Molina, co-president, Nicolas Walder, co-president, and Mrs. Maya Graf, vice president. Remark, the appeal will also be read out at the following events and sent out as a press release. Press conference, today's press conference, and a rally on the 17th of May, tomorrow, broken chair in front of the UN in Geneva. Thank you so much. Voilà.
Thank you so much. Now, I would like to ask Ms. Chile Chukila to take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Yongala. Venerable Sikya Rinpoche, abbot of the Tashalumbu Monastery, a very close and strong supporter of Tibetan movement and struggle, Adrian Zolar, president of the Geneva for Human Rights, very close friend, Madam Kontat. I always prefer to call her Madam Kontat, even though she insists that I call her Marguerite, and the president of the Tibetan Community of Geneva. Thank you so much, firstly, to the Tibetan Community of Geneva for organizing this very important press conference, and also to the Press Club of Geneva for coordinating this event. Before I start a brief introduction of the event, may I acknowledge the presence of the Vice President of Tibetan Community of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, Tenzin Wangyal, President of the Tibetan Women's Association Central from Dharamsala, India, Tenzin Jomala, and also President of the Swiss Tibetan Women's Association, Sri Yujola. Very happy to have your presence today here. As I think it has been detailedly mentioned by, firstly by Yongala, and also a very important press statement and support statement by the presidents of the Swiss Parliamentary Group for Tibet on this very important occasion, may I convey our sincere gratitude to the Swiss parliamentarians for this very strong and very well-detailed petition to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It has been over 60 years that the Tibetan movement is ongoing. And this is a movement not just for the freedom, but also for justice. And in these last 60 years or so, the China-Tibet conflict has remained unresolved. It remains an international conflict, and much of the human rights violations that we are seeing today across the Tibetan plateau, across Tibet, is mainly stemming from this conflict. As today we are assembled here to discuss the 28 years of enforced disappearance of 11th Panchen Lama of Gedhun Choekyi Nyima, I think it is important to acknowledge, first of all, the contributions of the 10th Panchen Lama, who has very strongly strived for improving the situation inside Tibet. He was one of the pioneers who worked for the preservation and promotion of the Tibetan language, culture, and tradition. And after his death under mysterious and suspicious circumstances, what happened is that we have seen that the 11th Panchen Lama, who was recognized by His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the reincarnation of the 10th Panchen Lama, was abducted and kidnapped by the Chinese authorities. And within 3 days of his recognition, his entire family, including Chade Rinpoche, who was the head of the search committee of the reincarnation process, was also kidnapped. And till date, in the last 28 years, we do not know where they are. We do not know what their status is. We do not know if he has even received monastic education. We do not know if he is even alive. and at times that brings a lot of suffering and pain, not only for the Tibetans, but also the followers of the Tibetan Buddhism across the world. Of course, when the enforced disappearance happened in 1995, immediately the Tibetan community reached out to the UN and appealed for its intervention. But then, of course, China denied initially that there ever was such an enforced disappearance. And now, since the last 28 years, what they have been saying is that he and his family needs private life and they do not want to be disturbed. But then, there is no verifiable information on this statement that the Chinese authorities are making on his behalf. We have repeatedly requested the UN, we have repeatedly requested the international community to press China to grant access to Panchen Lama and his family. Again, China and the Chinese authorities have denied this access. What we have seen in the last 60 years is consistent and systematic persecution of the Tibetan Buddhism and the followers of the Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet. Of course, when in 1959, after the uprising of the Tibetans on March 10th, 1959, in the name of the democratic reforms, large numbers of Tibetan monasteries, the numbers stand around 6,000 monasteries that were destroyed. Nearly 2 million Tibetans were killed. And since then, this genocide of Tibetans has remained unrecognized and unacknowledged. And now the persecution continues. For the 5 consecutive years, the Freedom House has denoted Tibet as the least free region in the world. The recent report of the US State Department has called upon the US Congress to recognize China as a country of serious concern because of the large-scale religious persecution that Tibetans are facing in Tibet. In view of this, to keep it as brief as possible, may I once again, on behalf of the Tibetan communities across the world, on behalf of the Central Tibetan Administration, and on behalf of the Tibet Bureau Geneva, call upon the UN experts to continue to investigate the whereabouts of Panchen Lama, his family, his teachers, and of course, to press China to grant access to Panchen Lama and to ensure that he is alive and he is receiving monastic education, and of course, to ensure that the freedom, especially the religious freedom of Tibetans, is not only enshrined in the Chinese constitution, but also implemented and guaranteed for the Tibetans in Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chileshukila. May I now ask Venerable Zikyab Rinpoche, abbot of Teshi Rinpo Monastery, to take the podium. Thank you.
Dijingi ki kemne chino konsa kem gujim bachol ya kusung gujang undu tangwe tone endari ngaranzo de ani gichi ki seta sagu seta di ya chibgyu nambe ani ngaranzo kusab tenjo chodang takana shin diji sungshe nangye nambazo takana shin ngaranzo ani u ta pemelenzo ki ani chozo dang takana shin ani sane puri zobe zoshun takana shin sane takage pume zobegi zozo ta de zobe ta de pepe kundu namba tsamolo ya ani 참지 당 deneki ta taring deneki kogab sosoliya chongbade to shesuyus.
I will be translating. Firstly, paying my reverence and obeisance to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, may I convey my tashitelek and greetings to the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to the co-panelists, Mr. Adrian Zoller, to the Vice President of the Tibetan Community of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, to the President of the Tibetan Women's Association Central, as well as the Swiss chapter, of course, to all the panelists and co-panelists present here on the dais, and all the people present here. Thank you for your presence.
Teni da taringe de kunse penjer mbuche ke tolya ani rigu shuye ti rigu shuye ti yang ani kunse penjer mbuche ani cholya ani ngaranzo da teme chinge ki peda Himalaya zebe ani zamni chilya teden saya mangbu ki ani sapshuje ani kunse penjer mbuche ke nedwen de shuyes.
Today I'm here to talk about the enforced disappearance of Kunsi Penje Rinpoche, and on behalf of all the followers of Tibetan Buddhism, including the people in Himalayan region, I'm here to talk and appeal for the release of 11th Panchen Lama Gedhun Choekyi Nyima.
Tina ne mixe ne shijingi ki tensa tashi limbugi chapche chi shuyes.
Especially I'm talking on behalf of the Tashilumbu Monastery, both inside Tibet and outside Tibet.
Kunsi Penche Rinpoche ki nedwen di pyoda Himalaya zobe zamni chila hajangi kene chambu chade yores. Kanyi shubha ina ngaranzo pyogi lugyu nangliya sungsoy la ngiman dawas cheche ani dende sungsoy yores. Ani tega nangshi ani chulu ki tohne shubha ina ani ngaranzo Kunsi Penche Rinpoche dang ani khonsa cho number 2 ki paruliya tawati ani che chinjung ki tawala soba dende ki thone chulu ki thone dende shuya yores.
The matter of Panchen Lama is of worldwide significance. He is being revered across the world as one of the Tibetan Buddhist religious leaders, and also, of course, if you look at the history and the religious tradition, the relationship between the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama is very sacred. Historically, both of them have been called as the sun and the moon, the Dalai Lama being the sun and the Panchen Lama being the moon, and as well as they have enjoyed and established a relationship of brothers, one being an elder brother and at times one playing the role of a younger brother.
Taganangshi rishung ki thone shubha ine ani ngaranzo lhamyo ki kyuze ki rishung nanglo la ani chino konsa kyamgu chambu choda Kunsi Penche Rinpoche ki tsuendeng ki thone chung tuyen tundup seche chapshung yores. Chesan dende ki thone rishung ki thone kyang ani ke chambu chag yores.
Even from a cultural angle, both the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama share a very sacred relationship of being tutors to one another.
Res ani teza masebe ani chino konsa kyamgu chambu choda Kunsi Penche Rinpoche ki parula pensu lalop tega nangshi ani pensu ani chen chiki chila chen so nangyata tega nangshi mixe ani chino konsa kyamgu chambu choda Kunsi Rinpoche number 2 ki palaya yangsi ngunzi nangre ki tewa di ki nanga di ki thone kya ani pe halebe ki kechimbu chungu yores.
It is also a very significant relationship that has been shared between the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, especially, as I mentioned, the relationship of a tutor and a disciple at different times, and also at times they have christened each other, especially naming each other and granting names to each other, and also at times have recognized each other's reincarnations, and therefore they have enjoyed a very special and sacred relationship between them.
Tende indu tang ngapju ngagu tugyu chungwe cheliya nganzu tsenjwe nangliya chino konsa kyamgu chumbu choki kudin le tene ane tade ngaranzo chwe rishu kiki ke tola halebe ki pusun soba yawa chadi yores. Ti nangshi Kunsi Penche Rinpoche kuntin chuba she shubwe kapsu Kunsi Penche Rinpoche kuntin chube ki uteche pe nangliya chwe de rishu kiki ke tola halebe ki kule kyon yores.
Since the 1959, with the contribution of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have been able to preserve and promote the Tibetan culture, language, and religion in exile. Similarly, when the 10th Panchen Lama was alive, he has contributed to a very great extent for the preservation and promotion of the Tibetan language, culture, and identity and religious traditions inside Tibet.
Takanashi kunsi penchelo mche kundi chube thone pyoge kei thola ani timso tsanzin soya nangaya ta takanashi di laglen taya ta takanashi ani pe di jinju ki ngaranzo man pele yunge ki chulo ki utire ta mangbo chiri ya sogyon naya la soba kanji thola halebe ki kule kyon yores mata imbe ta kuso chunje ke di che dole dang zay yores.
Particularly, the 10th Panchen Lama has been very gracious and has led a very pioneering role inside Tibet in not only ensuring the preservation of the Tibetan language, culture, and religious tradition, but also ensuring that necessary policies, necessary laws and guidelines are established and drafted inside Tibet in order to preserve the Tibetan language, religion, and tradition, and has also nurtured and promoted many Tibetan Buddhist religious leaders inside Tibet.
Today in the kunsi pension but shingla pebane songde ani ngaranju chede rishin ki ki tol ya nyamya ko chu pares ta thade chala chasha baina ani ngaranjo chigi chibegi ta ngaranjo ani zawang ki thone tenja lobda tayala soba nganju ki thol ya ta ki thol nyamcha chimbeki ta kunsi pension but ani shingla shabane songde ani tende ki kangye chi ko chu pares.
So since the passing away of the 10th Panchen Lama, what we have seen is consistent deterioration in the situation inside Tibet, especially in terms of language and culture and religious tradition. For example, in the recent times, what we have seen is that nearly 1 million Tibetan children have been forced into assimilation in residential schools. This absolutely leads to the deterioration and destruction of Tibetan language and culture and tradition, and this has been happening since the passing away of the 10th Panchen Lama.
Today in the Kondushibe ki nedan teda la shila shane ane kunse penjerum biche kundi chukji bochim bicho ane chidong kubjo kubjo konga chinda ngave ki che chupshi ninga ane kongsa choki yangsi ngunzin sera nambres senso nambre ane ti jela nyin sumgi jela ya ane kunse penjerum biche cho taka nangshin yang yung kukor kushab chaderum biche ta kushab chaderum biche tabu tsumbe ina yangsi tsushi tsochung ki tsoso tabu ki yan tso shingi chichadi yores cheza kong namba tso ane ngabe chubdini sungcheta tandapado melo nishu tsabge ringa kason chame to kyobe nedan tende chichade yores.
As mentioned earlier, it has been nearly 28 years since the enforced disappearance of the 11th Panchen Lama, who was recognized by the Dalai Lama by His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the 11th Panchen Lama on 14th May 1995. Immediately, within 3 days of his recognition, he was kidnapped by the Chinese authorities, his parents were kidnapped, and as mentioned before, the head of the search committee, Chade Rinpoche, was also kidnapped. So it has been now 28 years since the kidnapping, since the enforced disappearance, and we do not have any information about their whereabouts.
Today in the Kunsi Penjerum Biche, did you ta ngabe chubding chidong kubjo kubjo konga ngabe chubding the konglo truma to sen yo maris chesan today in the draw michi in bichani sosola drodo chusum ge rawanchi ko yo wares te hanan shi chi machi in bichani sosogi pudelia ane chi rawanchi drodo chusum ge rawan ko yo ba de rawan me ba ina machi in bichani misobe ge dunge semdu khazu nyang yo ba oda dendege toni chedu halebege nyensap chimbu chadiyores.
When the 11th Panchen Lama Gedhun Choekyi Nyima was abducted on 17th May 1995, he was barely 6 years old. As a 6 years old child, of course, he should enjoy his basic human rights. Similarly, his mother, who has just lost the child of 6 years old, she must be going through so much pain and suffering because of this kidnapping and this abduction. And similarly, she also enjoys all the basic human rights as any other human being. And therefore, with these kidnappings, it brings us a lot of pain and suffering for us as Tibetans and also for the followers of Tibetan Buddhism.
Tende indu ngaranzo samalo chulu gi chenrangji yimbi chane soso rangi chweshu ge lama ke chembuchik ani tende ji ta kason chame de kyobe ke nedan ta du ngaranzo ine lozap chembushibuchi chadi yores tende indu kunsi penchen rumbuchi ge nedun di ngaranzo pöden gi toliya chöde rawan re drami topdan re chibe topdan re kanji mangzo ine re kanji toliya me ram me be ke ani ji chunda ani le hashwechik tende ji chag yores chidan tende imbadi chi kyaje khala soso chabe kapso changme ge ngunji te tabaji nangda nangi tus.
So in this way, as disciples, as followers of Tibetan Buddhism, for us to lose a religious leader brings us a lot of pain and suffering. The kidnapping and the enforced disappearance of Panchen Lama is a symbol of how China has oppressed the Tibetans. It is a violation of not just religious freedom of the Tibetans, but also the rights of a child, the violation of human rights, and also the violation of democratic principles. For us, it is one of the easiest and one of the most prominent cases which symbolizes the oppression that is happening inside Tibet.
Ta tende indu tadong ngai gi tunse de dala tene ani nge regu shuguyos regu tangbote ta chidan chino konsa kyambu chumbucho ani ngaranzo a dichingi gi kyamne re tende indu kongyo ning gyonyu ni nyudo ani pela petoya da an kongge kongshi yebe ni me ume lamdelia ani number zoge kyabjo na ronans.
Therefore, I would like to request and appeal, firstly, that the protector of us, not only in this life, but also in future lives, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama may return to Tibet and his policy, the envisioning of the middle way approach policy gets more support, and that we are able to return to Tibet under his leadership.
Ta khana shi ta kunsi penjeram bache ta butsam baina ani chegi ne den digi tolya ani number zo sargo ba kejis number zo sargo ba number zo ki ani kana shung re ta khana shi ani chegi shung sa ba number zo re ani ne yo khande chi ne na tin zo khona zo le kunsi penjeram bache ke ne den ani kunsi di tola tize na ya di yang zo kunsi penjeram bache ke kuso ke ne da thande ne da khande yeme ani koyung ke tola re khande tola. Secondly, I
would like to request the press and the media to press the Chinese government, to press the international community, the United Nations, and of course the governments across the world to press for information on Panchen Lama's whereabouts, to find very verifiable information on his well-being, and also that he is receiving necessary religious education, and to ensure that we receive necessary evidence of his well-being and his whereabouts.
Ani shibe ngishu nga nyingade tunga kegyoris ta sanyi da bucha shana nga be chudu nyingade jinsu ngimo kegyoris tende indu tunga da jinsu ngimo da tune nambuso ki ani kunsi penjerum buchi ki toliya ani kha zamni chiliya koto mangz pe thoya da ani jagdam la so ba khang goku ni tab khaji yoze ki tone ani chi Jana mabe session la kota traba chi da tene ani khonanzo ki samshe ki tone ani len yobachi
Also, April 25th marks the birthday of the Panchen Lama, and May 17th marks the Enforced Disappearance Day of Panchen Lama. In this regard, I would like to request all of you to press to ensure that you bring about all your necessary resources, pooling your necessary resources to ensure that enough awareness is created about the enforced disappearance case of Panchen Lama, and also ensuring that the Chinese Communist Party-led government receives necessary message to ensure that the the whereabouts of Panchen Lama Gedhun Choekyi Nyima is released to the world.
Ani sosogi rewala ani kuzi benjerum buchi gyoni nyodo lodo topne ani cheno konsa kyamgu chumbu choge kagung shisong gi tone chöda rishung ki gi tola uchi tobu ngeji da ani zamni chile shide gi toli ya lamden tungeji oda jik dendegi yongya ji rewada melam shugu yes ani tendichi da ani ngaranzo geji shungda shungde mayimbe chobo chamala kunse benjerum buchi neduen la tola tunanda ani halebe kyabjo namba de toji cheda neduen tajo majung gi parlaya tadung ya ngale labe ke kyabjo da bezo nang ronans and tadun zamni shide yo ke mindu yes.
Finally, I also hope and pray that that we are able to receive the blessings of 11th Panchen Lama, that we are informed about his whereabouts, and that he will be able to take his charge as the 11th Panchen Lama and be a messenger of peace, love, and compassion across the world. This is my hope and this is my prayer, and I would like to conclude with a prayer for world peace and for better world.
And tell Chugila to Shana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zika Brimbuche. May I now request Mr. Edwin Claude Zoller to take the podium.
Thank you very much. Indeed, since 1995, I've been involved in support to the human rights activities in favor of the Tibetan people, Tibetan groups. And I will give some comments on the basis of this experience. And yesterday night, when preparing my notes, I was reading again this excellent article prepared by a good friend of mine, Gavang Chupal, who has been a leader in the NGO world and who served as a Tibetan office in Geneva during several years as well. Reading this, he has prepared the whole history of this case at the UN, so I took some quotes from him in what I'm going to say. But I don't want to repeat the chronology of the events which have been clearly given by the previous speakers. The first question is, why would China kidnap a child, 6 years, and all the members of his family? Why would China, after so many years, still refuse to give information? Why would a superpower feel threatened by a small group of Tibetan survivors of the series of massacres which took place in all the region of Tibet? Similar policies applied also and still apply in Xinjiang, in Inner Mongolia, and probably in other regions where a minority exists in China, whilst we are not aware of it because of lack of information. The case of the Panchen Lama, in my view, illustrates the Chinese Communist Party's policy to eradicate the religions, tradition, and culture of its minorities in an attempt to assimilate them. Obviously, as we have seen in recent years, China does not care about human rights. After Tiananmen, there was a subcommission of 26 experts in the UN, and this subcommission adopted a resolution on Tiananmen. It was in August 89. In August 91, the subcommission also adopted a resolution on Tibet. And this was the beginning of a strong, at the beginning secret, but more and more public policy of China to stop the evolution of the human rights movement and to gradually, step by step, destroy what human rights defenders from all the world had gradually built up inside the United Nations. The situation of Tibet came on the agenda of the Commission on Human Rights in 1992 because of this resolution of the subcommission in 1991. However, no resolution was adopted by the Commission. And it remained the same story every year at the annual session of the Commission on Human Rights, that draft resolution to raise the issue of human rights abuses in China were stopped by a no-action motion introduced, tabled by China. And each time, this no-action motion found a majority of member states in the Commission on Human Rights. After the abduction and enforced disappearance of the Panchen Lama, Tibetan NGOs, with the support of many NGOs promoting human rights inside the UN system, regularly raise the case of the Panchen Lama. I just give you the quote from one of the intervention of, it was 15 NGOs in their joint statement, and they said that the disappearance of the Panchen Lama was a crime being committed by the People's Republic of China, and they produced also many communications to special rapporteurs of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. The 3 special rapporteurs were allowed to visit Tibet during their official visit to China. It was the one on freedom of religion. It was a Tunisian expert, Mr. Ramos. It was in 94, and probably the issues he has raised and the discussion of his report in 95 in the Commission on Human Rights has led really to a stronger reaction of China when the Dalai Lama officially recognized the Panchen Lama 25 years ago. The second special procedure who was allowed to visit China was the procedure on arbitrary detention. It is a working group whose members could on 2 occasions visit China. It was in 97 and 2004. And finally, the special rapporteur on torture visited China in 2005. So we have 3 reports by the experts of the Commission on Human Rights, now the Human Rights Council, who have been published separately and who were discussed by the Commission on Human Rights and now by the Human Rights Council. Many special procedures also reacted to what happens in China in particular in Tibet. For Tibet, I would like just to refer to the following special rapporteurs: violence against women, adequate housing, human rights defenders, independence of the judiciary, racism, and obviously the working group on enforced disappearances. It's officially called a working group on enforced or involuntary disappearances. as defined by the Declaration of the United Nations and later the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. The crime of enforced disappearances is a continuous crime until the fate or the whereabouts of the disappeared persons becomes known. This is why the working group, 25 years later, it still exists as a working group of the Human Rights Council. This working group is still considering the case of the 11 Panchen Lama as an open case. So they continue to raise the issue with the Chinese government. A good illustration of the Chinese position is a statement of 7 September 2005. And I quote, Gedhun Choekyi Nyima is not the Panchen Lama, but merely an ordinary Tibetan child. At current time, the Chinese said, Nyima is in good health, and just like other children, he is leading a normal, happy life and receive good cultural education. I was going to read cultural revolution, but it is education. And I continue to quote, according to our understanding, he is already at secondary school and his school results are good. He and his family are not willing to let this interfere with their normal life. Mao Zedong, doctrine, strategy, together with Pontius Pilatus. The working group has been also raising the issue of enforced disappearances of children, and there have been specific thematic reports of the working group, and the case of the Dalai Lama was mentioned in this. That's for a brief overview of what has happened so far inside the United Nations regarding this issue. Now, several other comments. It has become a dramatic situation in Tibet, in particular with and after the COVID pandemic. Information is almost totally lacking. But second, the Russian invasion of last year of Ukraine has changed the paradigm of the international discussion on human rights. Before, human rights defenders in the world, each time they raise one issue, the government concerned replied by saying state sovereignty, non-interference, territorial integrity. Now, the territorial integrity has been violated in Ukraine. It has not been condemned by China so far. And if it is the case for a part of Ukraine, why not for other territories controlled by other states? Hence the importance of culture, of tradition, of religion. If the Tibetan people survives despite the repression, the killings, and the assimilation policies, if they survive, the day will come that they could be independent. The same occurred in Timor-Leste. And it is not by accident that Ngavang was quoting at the beginning of his article, so it was an article published just before he died in 2019. And he quoted José Ramos Horta, who has been last year re-elected president of Timor-Leste. And José Ramos Horta, I don't want to read you this quote, but just to mention it. The current battle in the United Nations is a battle on information. And with the artificial intelligence, it will not be easy for the non-governmental sectors and for representatives of non-represented people, such as the Tibetan, to prevail on the information of the government. The word reliable information, reliable, has been introduced by China and other hardliner states in many resolutions in the United Nations and in the very mandate of the Human Rights Council. For these hardliner states, reliable means information provided by the government. Starting by no, there are no camps. Then, yes, there are education centers. Then, calling these education centers vocational training, in the case of Xinjiang. And gradually, as we see now in the public debate and in the few information we receive from Tibet, also in the case of Tibet, for children who are almost abducted, at this moment forced to go out of their family to be in school. That's a new phenomenon, and gradually one shall recognize that the schools are not exactly schools. That's it. And ultimately, we know that the Chinese will call it educational center, where they will lose their language, their tradition, in order to be better assimilated. It's not only a case of enforced disappearances, the abduction of the Panchen Lama. It is a case of assimilation of any other culture than the majority of the population.
Thank you so much, Adrian, especially for your brief yet very detailed information in the case of 11th Panchen Lama inside United Nations. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Now I would like to pass the mic to the audience if you have any questions. And I ask you to kindly introduce yourself briefly and also mention who do you want to ask the question. Thank you. Any questions? Si vous avez des questions, vous êtes les bienvenus. Même en français, comme ça, j'essaie de traduire.
There is maybe another question, comment we could make, namely, why is China threatened by Tibet, by the Tibetan culture? Tibetans are Buddhist. Why is the Communist Party of China threatened by Buddhists? There are many more Buddhists in China than in Tibet only. Probably it is more than a question of assimilating all the peoples. The control of religion seems to be a major concern of the repression.
Thank you so much.
Je voulais savoir, il y a la dame et le monsieur là, qui sont ici pour préparer, si je ne me trompe pas, une tournée concernant une conférence au mois de février. Donc, est-ce que c'est l'année prochaine et c'est quoi cette tournée et cette conférence?
아니 다 군세 펜션 저기 다 내된 돌아 지단 아니 건배응연에 니마 랍드린 번나요래 아니 다 탈린 소소캅스 바바 캠베지 미차네 도스 고주엘 도스 잡디 단나니 아니 팅웰이야 아리체 아니 아리리 체 데니 캐나다 체 데니 잉글랜드 oda tene dosa ane di membe gi chida geo ka ki trezo ku tumi number so chebe ka so ane dosa ne de tolia teshe italy ona te gana shin ta tari ngana zo delia dosa cha che zo trezo tumi number re shungi ku tin number ne yo number je ta gana shin ane ji sagwe ba number re changma de je ta kunse penche re mji ki ne de ti kang tu tu chi kodo pe to ya chi dan dele tene ane ji kana ma be sin shu ki samje ton ta chi Delia, Panda Kunze Tembachi Lenda, Chunatang, the little Toya, Tendek Toneta, Nedin, Kondo Shubeki, Nedin Kitchen, but Tedala, Deni, and those Tandachata Chashipayins.
De manière générale, la monastère de Tashi Lumpo a déjà fait beaucoup par rapport à la situation du 11e Panchen Lama. Là, à l'état actuel, étant donné qu'il est l'abbé du monastère, il a décidé de faire cette tournée. En fait, la tournée, elle est déjà en cours. Il a déjà été aux États-Unis, au Canada et en Angleterre. Et puis là, aujourd'hui, il est à Genève pour justement pouvoir sensibiliser un maximum de public et les personnes qui sont au pouvoir pour que peut-être enfin la Chine puisse libérer le 11e Panchen Lama. Donc, il va continuer la tournée. Peut-être, vous avez peut-être un peu mal compris, peut-être. Ouais, là, il a commencé sa tournée depuis le mois d'avril. Alors, si vous n'avez pas de questions, je me permets de conclure l'événement. Mais avant cela, j'aimerais bien, comme cela a été mentionné par les membres qui sont là, nous organisons une manifestation à la Place des Nations demain à partir de 11h, justement, pour un peu célébrer, si je peux dire ça comme ça, ou marquer les 28 ans de la disparition forcée de 11e Panchen Lama. So tomorrow marks the 28 years of forced disappearance of 11th Panchen Lama. In this regard, we are organizing a demonstration in front of United Nations tomorrow from 11 a.m. Adrian?
Oui, je pense qu'il faut replacer l'enlèvement et la disparition forcée du Panchen Lama dans un contexte plus large pour atteindre un public. Si vous ne le faites pas, vous allez avoir simplement, c'est une personne, et il y a des millions de morts en Chine. Il faut essayer de faire ce lien-là qui me paraît très important pour aborder la question face à l'opinion publique. D'ailleurs, par exemple, la première question qui devrait venir, c'est que le Panchen Lama n'a pas tout à fait le même visage actuellement. Il a 31 ans et qu'on peut se demander si on peut encore parler d'une libération lorsqu'il a été enlevé, qu'il a disparu et qu'il n'est sans doute pas emprisonné. Je vous parle très franchement. Et je pense que autant il est important de célébrer un événement qui a été une violation grave des droits de l'homme, qu'il l'est toujours, autant il faut faire le lien avec la situation actuelle. Should I say it maybe in English? It is important, in my view, to link the debate, the information on the fate of the Panchen Lama with a broader issue, namely that of religious freedom. The Panchen Lama is now 31 years old. And to convince the public with a photograph of a child seems to be difficult.
So I would like to thank everyone who came here for this press conference today. And before we part ways, we have a photo session. Donc on a une séance de photos ici. Ouais.